That was the main theme from Yoik of the Wind by Sophia Yanok. The link to the full video is in the description. And the whole song is essentially built out of that one tune. In the diagram on screen, I've represented this as theme 1 or theme I in the lighter green colour. And what you can see happening is that the main theme is given to us 4 times, starting with 3 times in a row, but then followed by a variation section which I've treated as something different, although actually it's very much just a variation on this original theme. And then we have one final repetition of the familiar main theme. So that is quite a lot of repetition, but I think the song manages to stay interesting and create the sense of it being a complete song that unfolds a story from the start through to the finish. And primarily that seems to be being done by a pretty standard technique of increasing what you might call the intensity as the song progresses until eventually reaching a recapitulation where we come back to a point of rest. So one of the techniques that the song uses to build that intensity is an increasing tempo. And what you can see starting on the left of the diagram is that the first rendition of the main theme lasts for 40 seconds, but then when she repeats it, she covers the same tune in just 35 seconds, and then even quicker down to 31 seconds. The section 2 in the slightly deeper green is then actually a lot quicker. You can see in the diagram that it's the shortest section of the song, lasting for just 27 seconds, but that doesn't give the full picture because the original theme, the theme 1, is made up of what I would count as being 4 phrases, whereas this variation section contains the equivalent of 6 phrases. So the equivalent of the normal 4 phrases would be up to that dotted line that I've put through that section, but then we've got the length of 2 more phrases after that, all within this one section. So more material, 50% more material, is being covered in those 27 seconds compared to the other sections, so the tempo really has been stepped up. And then we have the reduction in tempo at the end to complete the journey, which at 33 seconds is still a fair amount quicker than the very first presentation of the tune at 40 seconds. But in contrast to that much quicker variation section, it feels slow again. Also increasing the intensity is a gradual intensification of the dynamic with a crescendo through most of the song and then a sudden drop-off for the ending. But unsurprisingly, the intensification isn't just left to being a constant, steady increase. Rather, there are specific points where changes are introduced, which punctuate the song and make the repetitions different each time. So starting off, we have no drum beat at all, and the singing is very soft in tone. But then from the start of the next rendition, she introduces a simple drum beat, which is just one strike of the drum on the downbeat. Then for the next rendition, the drum beat continues, but she noticeably starts modifying the tone of her singing, dipping into her chest voice here and there, and increasing the volume. Her vocal technique changes again for the variation section, and now we get 2 drum beats per measure, creating something like a heartbeat effect. Then finally her singing returns to a quieter, lighter tone, and she keeps the drum rather than completely removing it, but it's down back to that single drum beat. So that's how the song has been structured. That's how an entire song, a satisfying whole, has been created from essentially just one theme, which I find quite exciting in its simplicity, as I feel it works, and it shows how you can do a lot with a little. But now that we've seen how that one tune has been turned into a full song, let's turn our attention to the theme itself and see what's going on. So here I tried to draw out the tune, and by drawing it I find that helps me observe the patterns in it because I can view it as a static whole rather than trying to listen to it and re-listen to it in motion, going through it live, because after all music is a performance art in that it only actualizes itself through performance, whether that's a live performance or whether that's replaying a recording. Music takes place in time, it's not static, but there's nothing stopping us from analysing it statically so that we can take in more of it than simply what we can hold in our working memories at any one time. I don't know whether there's a pre-existing name for this type of melody analysis and drawings like this. In my own head I've been tending to refer to them as melodograms, just to myself, which is okay. But I'm not completely committed to that term because drawings like this don't just have to be about melody. I think drawing music, whether it's rhythms, chord relationships, keys, structures, whatever, is potentially a very useful way for getting a grip of what's going on So this is what this is for. This particular drawing does need a caveat, because one of the other things that Sophia Yanok does during the song is that she varies the melody slightly each time, giving the tune a few small variations here and there, and ornamenting notes slightly differently, and the whole thing is pretty rubato. So each time you hear the melody, it's a bit different. But what I've drawn here is my attempt to show the general shape of the melody, simplifying a few things here and there and amalgamating some other things. So this is not precisely accurate to any of the individual renditions, but hopefully it's useful enough for doing analysis. So, as you can see, and as I've mentioned before, I'm considering this tune to be made up of 4 phrases, and they're structured as A, B, C, B, where this phrase is a B and this phrase is a B because they're essentially the same. Now, those of you familiar with line structures and phrasing structures may be aware of what's known as a period, which is a phrasing structure that goes A, B, A, C, where it's the first half of the 2 lines that is the same and the second half that's different. The structure of this tune is like the inverse of that, because here it's the second half of the 2 lines that are the same and the first halves that are different. So I might call this structure an inverted period, but maybe there's already a term for it that I'm not aware of, or maybe someone else can think of a more intuitive term. But anyway, with a normal period, the repetition from the first half of the lines binds the melody together and helps cement its identity, while the second halves provide the variation and development that allow the tune overall to take us on a journey, going somewhere and then ending up somewhere. The normal period structure benefits from the fact that the second phrase of the first line, the B phrase, can deliberately leave things unresolved. So there's an emotional momentum that carries us through into the second line, where we'll often get some kind of resolution or at least an interesting response to what happened in the first line. With the inverted period, however, there's some risk involved, which may be why this A, B, C, B structure is something that I haven't come across so regularly. Because both lines end with the same phrase, you may struggle to achieve the satisfaction of this final phrase being a culmination of everything that's gone before it, particularly in relation to this phrase, where in the normal period structure, this final phrase would be a response to this B phrase. In the inverted format here, you may find that this final phrase ends up feeling like a known entity that isn't delivering any new answers, it's just a repetition. So that final phrase could be a problem. Alternatively, if you do get this to feel like a satisfying resolution, you may accidentally short-circuit your melody here by grinding it to a halt at the end of the first line without any momentum pushing it through into the second line. So it's not straightforward. But I think this tune does that very successfully. I like the contour of this phrase, starting at a high point and carefully subsiding down onto the root, which here is an A. Also the slow tempo helps because each phrase takes time, and so it's a real journey down to the root, floating downwards, where we're anticipating the resolution and waiting for it to be delivered, and there's musical tension along the way. Musical tension, not an actual tense feeling, but that makes it satisfying when we do actually come to rest. And therefore the first line doesn't feel like a dead end, in my opinion. We've got a taste of the journey, but we are expecting something to happen next. Because of the slow, graceful unfolding of the tune, I don't feel like we've been hammered into the ground and cut off by an early resolution. There's the space in the tune to leave an opening for something to happen next. Then I think, unsurprisingly, the third phrase is the one that contains the highest notes, marking the apogee of our journey. So we get a desirable sense that we've started somewhere, we've gone somewhere, and we've ended up somewhere. And finally, the repetition at the end succeeds in feeling like a satisfying resolution, which now feels like a true resolution now that we've gone where we have. So the last point I'll make about the journey is how the A phrase and the C phrase are made to feel slightly open-ended, which then helps create a forward momentum and a sense that the final phrases are actually resolving something from the opening phrases. I think that this tune accomplishes that by making both the A phrase and the C phrase finish on the fifth up from the root, which in this case is an E. Now, when used in a melody, the fifth won't often create a huge amount of musical tension that feels like it needs to be resolved, because the fifth is typically a note from the tonic chord, which feels pretty stable, and could well be used as the final note in many melodies. But when contrasted with the root, it's comparatively open and in need of resolution. And since this melody uses a fall down to the root in its resolutions, these upward ticks to the fifth create just enough forward momentum to make the tune flow, in the context of what is a largely reflective, meditative atmosphere. One thing that you may notice from this drawing is that it's not just the B phrase that's identical between the first line and the second line. It's actually everything from this point forwards, although again reminding you of that caveat that Sophia Janok varies how she ornaments notes. That's quite unusual, and if I look at just one of these, then what I get is that because it's repeated, this part of the tune is the basis for around 70% of the main theme, and what this means is that 50 to 60% of the whole song comes from this one musical idea here. So after coming up with these few notes, she's, in one way of looking at it, over halfway to having the full song. This just shows what you can do from a small musical idea, and this isn't some cheap trick. This is a skill. Good composers know how to take a starting idea and build music from it. And yes, it can make things simpler for you as a composer, because you don't have to constantly be coming up with new material to build out a piece. But it also works musically, because the repetition and the continuity cement the identity of your piece, as opposed to just having a sprawl of ideas. And the variation and development that you do add feels like a logical expansion of your original ideas, rather than having a sequence of poorly connected ideas shoved together one after the other. So it's quite empowering to realise the possibilities of using simple ideas to build longer passages of music. The final thing I'll note from this is what I might call the pulse, which I've represented with these vertical lines on the diagram. And in this form of analysis, when I say pulse, I mean the pulse of the melody, not the pulse of the drumming, not the pulse of a musical accompaniment, if there were one. It doesn't mean something that's deliberately played or even accented. Rather, the pulse is something that arises from where the notes in the melody fall, and seeing what's the most regular pattern of where those notes fall. Here you can see that not all of the notes fall on what I've deemed to be the pulse. That's fine, that's to be expected. A melody would probably be quite boring if it just followed one basic pulse all the way through. The deviations from the pulse make the tune more characterful and make it more interesting. But when picking out the pulse, we're expecting the pulse to be something pretty consistent and simple. And for this tune, that's certainly the case. What we've got is a repeating heartbeat pattern that runs through the melody, coming from where the notes are landing in time again and again. And you may remember from earlier that we saw the drum playing a heartbeat rhythm during the variation section. So it's perfectly fine for the rest of the music to be playing the pulse and reinforcing the pulse of the melody. But again, when we're talking about pulse in this kind of analysis, it's a pulse of the melody, not the rest of the music. Okay, so I've said a lot about this song. I could say more, but I won't. This is a wonderfully simple piece of music, but still there's a lot to observe and a lot to learn when analysing structure and melody in this way. The final thing that I've done to help myself understand it better is to write my own response to it. I haven't written a full song yet, I've just written a main theme, but I based my theme on that same pulse, that same heartbeat pulse used in Yoik of the Wind. But to get my creative juices flowing, I deliberately changed the contours of the phrases. So in particular, these B phrases that roll downwards in Yoik of the Wind, I deliberately tried to create B phrases that went upwards. So this is what I came up with.